the ability of the Russians to make offensive gains is really being inhibited. Now, the other thing which the American weapons and the release authority of the British and Swedish, French weapons has enabled is the Ukrainians to fight a far deeper campaign with the ranges in Crimea. Now that is significant because it's almost making Crimea untenable for the Russians in terms of strangling it as a logistic hub, pushing their air defense further away and their sea forces further away.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And today we are catching up with Major General Chapman. He was a platoon commander in the Falklands conflict and went on to command 2 Para. Chip's a former British military advisor to US Central Command and spent 33 years in the military. Chapman, welcome to Frontline. Good to see you again. Can you just start by giving us your overview of the current situation on the battlefield in Ukraine?
Well, it's interesting, Kate, that I've really been away for the last 2 months traveling the world. And if I'd have been in a time machine, I could almost give you the same analysis 2 months ago as I would now, apart from one thing. And that is then the Ukrainians were, I think I characterized it as losing slowly, and that the American aid which would come would be needed to equalize the battlefield. That would be a situation which was very similar to the situation in June 22. And I think that that has happened really, although there's more aid to come in terms of the equalization of the battlefield. So really what you characterize it now in a number of words would be that the Russian offensive is really, anywhere you look, both in north and northeast of Kharkiv city, in the Luhansk Oblast and in the Donetsk Oblast, they're really on a mark time offensive. And they're really only making micro gains. And if you, the kind of words you use about the situation all along the front line really is either unchanged, trying to advance without success, or marginally advanced. So these are still just minor tactical gains which really have no operational import. And there are a number of reasons for that. And the first thing is the impact of these weapons, and particularly not just the American weapons, but the sort of release authority of the weapons given by a number of Western nations. And by that, I mean the ability to strike, deeper into Russian territory. Because although at the moment, Zelensky has been warning that there is still a grouping from the northern grouping of forces, which is 90 kilometers away from Kharkiv, essentially the second echelon of forces, you have to be able to bring that second echelon of forces to bear. And with the release authority, the Ukrainians have been able to strike troop concentrations, logistic builds up, road convoys and things like that. So will they be able to bring this second echelon to bear when the first echelon is being mired in the mud? I don't think they will. Because one of the things that we've seen throughout this campaign is although that communications and digital profiles act and operate at the speed of light, we've really have people who are operating at the speed of a crawl in terms of the tactical opportunities. So all this means that the ability of the Russians to make offensive gains is really being inhibited. Now, the other thing which the American weapons and the release authority of the British and Swedish, French weapons has enabled is the Ukrainians to fight a far deeper campaign with the ranges in Crimea. Now that is significant because it's almost making Crimea untenable for the Russians in terms of strangling it as a logistic hub, pushing their air defense further away and their sea forces further away. And it is significant that only on the 10th of June there were a number of S-300 and S-400 air defense systems taken out by, I think, 10 American ATACMS systems. And there's suggestions that the Russians are going to move their S-500 Prometheus, their anti-ballistic missile defense, into Crimea to try and have this air defense bubble around Crimea. Now, that would be significant to see what the sword versus the shield would be in terms of the Russian air defense against Western technology and Western missile systems. One of the things that you can say about the S-300 and S-400, which have had quite a lot of export success for the Russians, is that it doesn't really work very effectively. And that's also been one of the reasons, for example, that it's not been turned on in support of the Syrian air defense profile when the Israelis have been attacking Iranian targets in Syria, the IRGC targets, over the last 4 or 5 years.
And what do you think the current Ukrainian strategy is regarding Crimea? Has it changed or does it remain the same? Because according to some analysts, for example, the need to take out the Kerch Bridge is no longer there. And you've mentioned those successes on strikes into Crimea itself.
Well, I think you've seen recently again a number of ferries being taken out, part of the logistic support route, as it were, to Crimea. I think that psychologically, dropping the Kerch Bridge would be helpful, but I don't think you will see it being dropped at the moment by the Ukrainians because you need to set the conditions for that operational and strategic success for dropping that bridge. And that is when Putin would really be on the back foot because, again, it's the politics of Crimea from a Russian perspective that actually matter. It was that sort of notion in 2014 that he was raising up and gathering in the Russian people by annexing Crimea, and therefore everything from there on in would be a walkover. And of course, that's not been the case. So if Crimea goes and is untenable, then Putin potentially loses power. And that's always really been either directly or indirectly the Ukrainian notion of victory, really, in the same way that Russia understands that it can't take over geographically all the territory of Ukraine. And its theory of victory goes along the lines of disrupting the willpower and determination of the West to support Ukraine, and therefore leading to a settlement which is on Russian terms. And that's really the big divergence that you've seen in the last week or so with the Russian notion of a peace plan versus Zelensky's notion of a peace plan in Switzerland last week.
Yeah, but Vladimir Putin's notion of a peace plan, ceding Russian-occupied territories, I mean, to Russia, I mean, it was ridiculous. He knew it was going to be refused before he even put that plan forward, didn't he?
Well, not necessarily from the perspective of the axis of dictatorships, and not necessarily from those people who sort of support his notion of a multipolar world and see the Americans as an imperial power. But if you look at all the various notions of peace deals, he would probably say that it is a humanitarian peace because it stops the killing. But of course, if you flip that coin, it is a surrender peace because the sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine has been diminished. They would have to get out of the four oblasts, which Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, which the Russians have not even taken. So the other two oblasts we didn't mention in terms of the situation on the battlefield at the moment. Luhansk, the offensive continues there, but the operations on the Kupiansk, Satovi, Crimea line remain unchanged. It's another one of those offensive areas where it's unchanged. And in Donetsk, though there have been advances in the Chasiv Yar direction, particularly in the last week or so, these are again just micro gains. And 3 months ago, I said the same thing, that the backbone of the Ukrainian Donetsk defense is the line along Kramatorsk-Sloviansk, which could threaten Pokrovsk. But it's the same as 3 months ago. It hasn't, because they haven't really had anything other than classical gains.
Having said that, the MOD in London is reporting that Russian forces are within striking distance of the main supply route for Ukrainian troops defending the eastern Donbass region as it continues to push towards the garrison city of Pokrovsk. What would that mean if they do cut the supply route? And what if they do take that city?
Well, I don't think they're anywhere near that. It would be very significant, but in terms of geography, it's still, I think, about 80 kilometers away. So it would mean that they would achieve one of their objectives for the year, because the whole of the Donetsk Oblast would become untenable to the Ukrainians should they go that far. But there's a lot of fighting before you'd even get to that position. So I don't think that notion of encirclement and cutting that is credible at the moment. So I don't see that as something which is going to occur in the short term. The real sort of toing and froing at the moment is between the sort of sword and the shield. I think between the ISR drones, the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance drones of the Russians being targeted by the first-person view drones of the Ukrainians. And within that, you have this electronic warfare bubble where, the notion of who wins the electronic battle between drone, counter-drone, and guided weapons is really significant. That will inhibit or enable forces to move in the future. And that really comes onto this notion again of control of the air, because all the things to do with drones are really just a democratization of the air battle and delivering it at a lower level than it's been with the use of air power historically. So it's just another notion of air power for the future. And that's also really interesting when you get to, for example, notions of the F-16, because there were four factors for success in 20th century warfare. The first was control of the air. It's absolutely a necessity. The second and third are shock and surprise, which the Russians may have had in terms of their offensive towards Kharkiv city, but that started on the 10th of May, so we're already sort of 6 weeks down the line with not much gained. And the fourth one is offensive recce. Now, all those, unless you have all those factors together, your ability to achieve operational success is really, really quite a narrow thing in front of you. So they're just not there for either side. So restoring that sort of mobility and breakthrough to the battlefield is what each side seeks to achieve. And one of the interesting things I think this week was the capture by the Ukrainians of one of the turtle tanks of the Russians. Now, it'll be interesting when they analyze that, because the turtle tank is really a large protected carrier which seems to be immune from loitering weapons and first-person view drones, but it carries an electronic suite and a flail type entrenchment or tool at the front to try and clear sort of a path for forces to pass through. The sort of notion from Little Heart of the expanding torrent, where you have a narrow breakthrough and then you can fan out to achieve operational success. So that shows you really the electronic battle that is going on. So I think there'll always be this to and fro, and the ECM battle, the electronic countermeasures battle, one side develops, one side counters. That is the one which will be interesting, I think, to see in the next few months.
The first F-16s are expected to arrive imminently, and the Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces, General Syrskyi, has said that, mindful of that, Russian forces are trying to make the greatest gains as quickly as possible. From what you're saying, they're not doing so well at that. How great an impact do you think the arrival of the F-16s will actually make?
Well, I don't think their arrival is going to be imminent, to be honest. I'd be surprised if they were here or in Ukraine this summer. Now,
Really?
the F-16, the F-16s are, for various reasons to do with both. You don't need it's not piloting the plane; it's fighting the plane. It's doing the engineering on the plane, the support of the plane. All those things matter in having the trained personnel along the sort of whole chain of getting a fast jet into the air and generating a number of sorties, which means it can fight multiple times. So what we do know is that the number of committed planes is 85 and rising, that pilots are being trained at sort of speed, but they're still not really into, I think, the sort of advanced weapons modules at the moment. And that they will make a difference, because one of the things that they will do is they will push back the Russians' ability to use their glide bombs, the CAB, in the way that they've been doing at the moment. And those are the things which are really doing the large-scale destruction of the cities which have been targeted, particularly in the Kharkiv city area and around the front line there, Vovchansk being the one which is the most pertinent, because about 80% of that has been destroyed, I think. So they will make a difference. I think Zelensky has said he'd like 120 to 130 to give some sort of parity with the Russian Air Force. We talk about various notions of air supremacy, air superiority, and air parity, but it depends where on the front line, because you want to maximize your combat potential at a particular point to achieve an effect or outcome at that time. But one of the things they will do is give them the ability, again, in the electronic warfare sphere, to probably negate a number of the Russian capabilities and to give the more freedom of action for the Ukrainian forces. And again, we'll have this toing and froing about how that works. So, for example, they're creating some of the weapon systems to be integrated on the F-16s, which will home in on the GPS jammers and that the Russians are using, which is hindering in certain aspects some of the drones of the Ukrainians. Now, again, that depends on the encryption sort of software that Ukrainians are using. It is far easier to inhibit the signal to a commercial off the shelf system than it is in military encrypted systems.
Is that the main capability you think that they would be useful in inhibiting?
Well, electronic warfare will be one of them because it's a multi-role fighter. Both the air-to-ground and air-to-air aspects will also be pretty crucial. So its ability to knock Russian aircraft out of the sky and its ability to provide close air support to the troops on the ground. Because, boy, that's a good capability when you need it if you're an infantier on the ground.
What and where do you see the signs that the US weapons that had been held up by Congress are getting through and starting to make a difference? Do you see any of that?
Well, I think you see it in their deep battle, really. So not necessarily all of the systems, because part of the deep battle for the Ukrainians is, of course, their attacks on the oil refineries, and we saw another 2 refineries yesterday taken out, one in the Tambov region and in the Adygia Republic. So we believe now that there have been 40 attacks on oil refineries by Ukraine, and that by the end of last month, 14% of refinery capability had been knocked out. And I think most of that is either by British and French systems, the Scalp and the Storm Shadow, rather than American ATACMS. But I think they have released authority for those troop concentrations and logistic concentrations, which does inhibit that sort of second echelon getting to the front. And I think one of the things that the Russians have done is not really planned in enough strength to have enough combat power to actually break through with the first echelon. If you're not doing that with the first echelon and you're being inhibited by bringing those forces to bear in the second echelon, then they'll have a really hard time in exploiting a lot further than where they are at the moment towards the north and northeast of Kharkiv city. But in some ways, that doesn't necessarily matter, because although the Russians would like to be within tube artillery distance of Kharkiv city, the fact that they are in sort of glide bomb range and are pummeling the city means 2 things, really. Firstly, their deep battle is energized this year, certainly from March on, hitting the electricity grid. And we already know that 50% of the Ukrainian electricity generating capacity has been destroyed this year, some of which won't be brought back online for years. Now, of course, you can import some from the European grid, but the notion that by the winter that large parts of Ukraine might be without electricity for 20 hours at a time, and therefore that part of the Russian theory of occupation, as it were, there and demilitarized zone, is you make a demilitarized zone and a depopulated zone, really, by making it uninhabitable for people who are forced to move. And the notion of people moving at scale from Kharkiv city and other cities does lead, the withdrawal of a population from one place to another can have a really debilitating effect on the morale of other citizens. So I think that is part of the way that the Russians are trying to fight their operational battle at the moment.
Sorry to interrupt. Is that what you think the plan then is for Kharkiv city, Kharkiv Oblast? Is that what you think the actual strategy is?
Yeah, I do. Now, of course, initially they might want to encircle it and take it in a good manner, but there's just no possibility of that, certainly in 2024, in my opinion.
So drive it out and create a buffer zone.
Yeah, make it untenable for the Ukrainians to live there. Then, when at some time you have a peace settlement, and no one's going to go towards that in negotiations at the moment, then that becomes something which is potentially up for grabs. It shouldn't be, again, in terms of the sovereignty of Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine would like to see reparations for the damage which has been done. All those things will be very big obstacles into coming to what would be an equitable solution. Now, an equitable solution is different from each side. Everyone wants the rule of law, but whose rules will apply is always the sticking point in these things for the future.
The Financial Times is reporting that the US government plans to divert Patriot air defense systems destined for other countries to Ukraine. And by the time this conversation is actually out there, that may already have been officially announced. And Romania is also donating a system. Where are these Patriot systems needed most, and how many is enough?
Air defense is never enough. You would like coverage over the whole country, but that is one of the problems that the Ukrainians have because of the fact that you can't be strong everywhere. Otherwise, you end up being weak everywhere. One of their dilemmas is they'd probably like some Patriot systems to be forward protecting an air defense envelope over Kharkiv city to stop sort of the ballistic missile and other attacks there. That would make them increasingly vulnerable. Now, in terms of military philosophy, we talk about a center of gravity, the source of all your strength. So protecting the capital city is nearly always the first notion that you do. And the S-500s are there. The Russian S-500s, again, is potentially a weakness of moving them down to Crimea, because the S-500s are there to be part of the anti-ballistic missile defense of Moscow replacing a system in the future. But it's always a political necessity to protect your capital. And then I think the Ukrainians need to protect those areas which are far away from the front line, because that gives you your rear area security. It's where people can live in more sort of harmony, not be psychologically under pressure, and take it from there. So, the capital is always the first thing. Your supply routes in from Europe and your other major cities, Lvov in the west, but there'll never be enough air defense to go everywhere. Coastline is coastline around Odessa and Kherson Oblast is also significant, because there's no doubt in my mind that the Russians would really have liked to take the complete sea bridge and make the coastline a Russian lake again. And I don't think they've got any chance of doing that either.
How do you expect the war to develop over the summer months? And do you think that the combination of US aid, the new ability to use foreign weapons in a limited way inside Russia, these developments, could it mean that the most dangerous point has been passed for Ukraine this year?
Yeah, I think the most dangerous point for Ukraine is passed. But again, it comes back to how wars end. Neither side is going to be strong enough to conquer the other in military terms or military geographic terms. So if you go back to the Second World War, Eisenhower's directive, because we've just had D-Day, was to, with allies, to go to the heart of Europe and destroy the German armies. You're not going to see Russia in a position to do that. Neither are you going to see Ukraine in a position to do that to the Russian army. And therefore, you go back to how wars end. And they end in three ways. Firstly, by decisive military victory. Chances of that are still pretty low. The second one, because of the indecisiveness of military victory, which leads to some sort of negotiation. That's not on the cards at the moment. Or the third one, which is going to be on the cards for both of them at some stage, but not yet, is because either the political, military, sociological, population, economic, social, cultural, social, economic, whatever you want, costs are too great to one side, and therefore the will and determination to go on is diminished to a point where you need to have a settlement. Essentially, that's what happened with the destruction of the will of the Russian army in 1917, leading to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And you could posit, I don't think it's likely at the moment, that with 1,200 casualties a day on the Russian side, with very marginal gains, you could get to a point when the Russian military walk off the battlefield. I don't think we're going to see that yet. The second one is, of course, is the centrality of Crimea to the myth of Russian imperialism. If that becomes untenable, then the elites in Russia could say enough is enough. Putin and his cronies need to be overthrown. And the final one is that the population of Russia has had enough and rise up and sort of dethrone him. Now, you probably to do that in a dictatorship is very, very difficult, but historically, you only need 3.5% of the population to take to the streets and show their massive dissent to bring about some meaningful change, as we saw, for example, in the revolutions in 1989, which deposed Ceausescu and some of those other Eastern Bloc countries. Neither of those, I think, is tenable in the next sort of 3 months, though.
Ukrainian troops are also tired. They need to be rotated. They need to be rested. New troops need to be trained and quickly. How well is the military leadership in Ukraine meeting that challenge?
That's a really interesting question because, of course, it's not only mobilizing people, but it's demobilizing people. And one of the things which has been put on hold in Ukraine is the Demobilization Act. The Demobilization Act should have been that after 36 months of service and being really tired, you would be allowed out of the service, but then you're losing a cadre of really well trained and professional people. And the second one was that you needed, the notion was that you need to rotate troops every 6 months. Now, both of those have been placed in abeyance because of the manpower constraints for the Ukrainians. Indeed, we had a new mobilization law in May, which didn't mention those things, but did bring, for example, the age of the draft down from 27 to 25 and put a series of other conditions in. It's always been the case that since the war started, men under the age of 60 aren't allowed to leave the country, with some exceptions, of course, as there always are. So there are problems in mobilization really for both sides. You've got a sort of crypto mobilization from the Russian side, and now you've got the Ukrainians after 2 years really mirroring what was sort of policy on the Russian side, with an ability, for example, to now sort of recruit people who've been in prison in Ukraine. Now, that was a forcible method with Prigozhin, of course, in the Wagner group in the early days of the campaign. But that is one of the other things that they're looking at, along with, for example, increased fines for draft evasion. So it's difficult times for that. But if you do believe that freedom and democracy are worth fighting for, then you would hope that there are enough people who come forward. And certainly the opinion polls in terms of those who still believe that Ukraine can win within Ukraine and understand the consequences of losing to Russia and Putin's Russia in particular means that I think that the things will be stabilized there in the future.
What more can Ukraine do beyond the battlefield to defeat Russia?
Well, like most of the things, it's always important to win the information ops battle. What I think we see is a lot more disinformation coming into the domain of the sort of social media and the media, with lots and lots of people sort of parroting Russian talking points, really. And this is partly a symptom of sort of war fatigue, and people would like to sort of see an out. But what's dangerous about that is it seeps into the sort of consciousness of people that things can be done differently. But there are often Russian points which are being parroted in things being done differently, particularly in terms of the notion of this is a war fatigue from everyone, and the simplest thing would be to stop this, and everyone would live in peace and harmony, which of course is not really true. It's only true in the short term sense, because the Putin, in my characterization, is still someone who wants to regain lost territories and spheres of influence. That begins with Ukraine. It doesn't end with Ukraine.
So are you suggesting that Ukraine could get better at mastering the disinformation?
I don't think Ukraine could get any better. I think they've been masters of it, but the Western press need to get better at it, or the Western governments need to get better at it. And that's been one of the problems at the moment. It's not really just the Western governments. Of course, there's a lot of fractures within the EU and America at the moment, which makes this sort of disharmonious environment more difficult for when you've got an absolutely focused Russian opponent on the other side. I think we saw it in a way with some of the comments from one of the candidates in the general election in the UK recently, who I think was sort of really parroting Russian propaganda points. I won't say who he is because there's an election on,
Yeah.
but it'll be pretty obvious, I think, to most people.
One of the constant criticisms of Ukraine's allies is that they've been slow to provide weapons, and it needs to, and when they do provide them, it's too cautious on saying how Ukraine can use them. Do you think that's changed now?
I don't think it's changed wholly. And that's always been, I think, because the fear of escalation and what that might lead to. But I think every time there's been a sort of Russian red line, which Putin has stated, we've crossed it with no action from Putin. So I think we can continue to call his bluff now from a military perspective, giving freedom of action with weapon systems of any range caliber that you want is, of course, how you would like to fight a battle and a war. But there is a what we call the strategy bridge between political intent and military power. And of course, all wars are fought for political purposes. It's just the warfare is the fighting bit. So of course we're limited by what politicians are worried about in terms of the consequences of escalation. And I've talked many times about how I see escalation in 7 areas, which I think are generally targets, objectives, geography, domains, which could be cyber and space, mobilization and rhetoric. And we've seen an uptick in rhetoric as well recently, particularly in the nuclear rhetoric again from Russia and more exercises. And that always puts people on a sort of strategic defensive when they don't necessarily need to be, in my opinion. There'd be other things you'd look for if you were saying that Russia were really going to release nuclear weapons. We would look for signs of imminency, which would be there, and we'd be on our sort of warning indicators and warnings in the intelligence committee, which we would know about.
Predictions about how long this war will last have varied widely. What could be the implications for European security and global security if it does last a number of years?
Well, I think the characterization we had previously previous to February 22 was that all wars will be short. And, most of the wars in the Middle East have been in the last 40 years. The wars that we've fought in the West against, in Iraq and elsewhere, the war fighting bit, not the war after the war bit, have been short. So we need to have a reality check that wars might not be short. And therefore, there are a number of things that flow from that in terms of having the industrial capacity to fight a long war, having the regeneration of your military force if necessary, and I'm not using any notion of conscription here to fight beyond the first battle and the second battle, but the battles which may occur after that. And really, the notion that scale is something which has been out of sync with our recent experience and thinking. So, understanding those things for the future is absolutely vital. And I've also said before that there's really two parts to war, a physical part and a psychological part. And it's not armies that fight wars, it's nations that fight wars. The Ukrainian nation absolutely has understood that in terms of their mobilization and will to fight. We've got to really make sure that there's that understanding in the Western sphere about those sorts of things. Because, I don't think Putin will stop, but it doesn't mean one of the fractures which could occur, and I've talked about fractures, is that just because you have an Article 5 NATO line, and let's say if Russia invaded one of the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, that doesn't mean that you'd have to put an armored division in support of them. So how you would do that, it's very difficult to see. So Putin would play on that in the sort of hybrid warfare kind of aspect, I think. So it's dangerous times, and the best way to keep that danger away, in my opinion, is to unequivocally support Ukraine with the weapons it needs, and that's the best way to avoid the characterization of World War III and any move towards World War III, which I think is overplayed if we support Ukraine.
Major General Chip Chapman, great to speak to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.